It is an enormous pleasure to be here this evening in conversation with Richard Flanagan, who is one of the most interesting and exhilarating writers working in the English language today. As you're doubtless aware, his most recent novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, won the 2014 Man Booker Prize and has been met internationally with rapturous acclaim and something like awe. The Guardian called it a classic in the making, and Ron Charles in the Washington Post wrote, "Beware Richard Flanagan's new novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. His story about a group of Australian POWs during World War II will cast a shadow over your summer and draw you away from friends and family into dark contemplation the way only the most extraordinary books can. Nothing since Cormac McCarthy's The Road has shaken me like this, all the more so because it's based on recorded history rather than apocalyptic speculation." It tells the story of an Australian doctor, Dorigo Evans, who interned in a Japanese prisoner of war camp on the Thailand-Burma Railroad during World War II, finds himself an unexpected and in some ways unlikely hero. This is a novel, too, about love, about the friendships between men in wartime and the fervent and abiding passions between men and women, occasionally illicit, often unexpected, and with lifelong consequences. This novel tackles the biggest themes, love, war, and death, and evokes a broad range of emotions. Its protagonist is both a hero and a lonely man with significant failings. He is, above all, a compelling and compassionate human being. This is a novel with descriptions so vivid that they will haunt you long after you put it down. It is a novel you cannot forget. Now, I had a whole other long thing, but I think I've talked enough. I just want to say, this, of course, is Richard's 6th novel, and all the others are very wonderful. Also, you may be familiar with Gould's Book of Fish, which was hailed as his masterpiece and is now being called his first masterpiece, which is a nice position to be in. I just want to say, too, that Richard has chronicled his Tasmania and his Australia from convict origins to the present day in the course of all these novels, and hopefully in the novels to come, conjuring a vital and visceral world that is both imaginary and profoundly true. It's an honor to have him here with us this evening. Welcome, Richard, and thank you for sharing with us.
It's over here. Well, thank you, Claire, and thank you all for coming. It is a great honour for me to be here with Claire, and a highlight for my visit here to America, because I've admired Claire's writing for many years. In answer to your question, what is my claim on Africa? To paraphrase your president, Africa had a claim on me in Chicago some years ago when I was introduced as one of Africa's leading novelists. A writer survives, I always think, to the extent to which he's misunderstood, which makes this such a marvellous country to visit. And I think they confused Tanzania and Tasmania, an embarrassment of consonants and continents, I guess. So I've learnt not to disagree with the wonderfully euphoric sort of descriptions you're given here, and thus I read to them about my Africa, and there it was. And the readers and the several homeless of Chicago who gathered that evening in the way of that wonderful Catholic and welcoming spirit of American book readings took that home, I think, as their own version of that continent. I am going to read because in my country you don't read for very long, because we have these things in hotels and the audience inclines to a certain violence very quickly, and so I read only for a short time. Otherwise it is, as Dostoevsky observed, no longer literature but corrective punishment. This is I did a gig in Germany once where I had a man who'd been described as he was a voiceover man, because they'd still dubbed their movies there, and he was the German voice of Brad Pitt. And any Brad Pitt movie, he was the voice. And I got to the reading and he was about 4 foot wide and even shorter, and he had these two little toad-like eyes that peered over the table. He read for 90 minutes, and that was just the first reading, and then they foolishly threw back to him, all in German. I didn't understand any of it, just had to fight the whites of my eyes going backward. At the end of the second reading, even the Germans who had shown remarkable stoicism and that sort of spirit of Stalingrad, that had enough, and they gave him a standing ovation, and I very falsely also applauded him and thanked him enormously and asked him the only thing I could ask, but had he read that for that interminable period in the voice of Brad Pitt, and he said no. He said, I taught for you a little bit more Kiefer Sutherland. Anyway, this is at the centre of this book, for those of you who haven't read it, there's a man is murdered, but his tragedy begins at the beginning of the day when he folds his blanket the opposite way to Japanese army regulations. And this short reading happens many years later. Decades later, Jimmy Bigelow would insist that his kids always fold their clothes so, fold ever outwards. He would open the drawers of the chest of drawers in their suburban weatherboard home in Hobart to make sure they were safe and the fold was out. He would never hit or smack them for not folding their clothes with the fold out. He would beg and plead. He would order and demand, and in the end, exasperated, he would refold and restack their clothes himself as they stood by, nervously waiting. He would feel some nameless terror that was beyond him to explain. A confusion they too would carry with them for the rest of their lives that was both love and fear, that was beyond the drawers opening and closing, beyond their father's frustration and mumbling. He knew they didn't understand, but could they not see? How could they not know? It should have been so obvious what had to be understood. You could never know when everything might change. A mood, a decision, a blanket, a life. They knew none of it. They only knew that whatever they did, he would never hurt them. At the very worst, he would throw them over his knee, bring his hand up and then hold it there, hovering over their bottom. Sometimes they would feel him shaking through his knees and thighs. They would steal a look upwards and see his hand trembling, his eyes watery. How could they know that their father was desperately trying to protect them from the unexpected smash of a rifle butt into their soft child's cheeks, to warn them of what horrors this hard world had ready for the unwary, the unwise and the unprepared, to prepare them for all those things for which no one could ever be ready. They knew only this one thing, that he would never hurt them. As his body trembled back and forth through time, they knew what he meant when he said, "Rightio," and suddenly threw them off his lap and back onto their feet. Averting his eyes, he would wave them away with an extended hand. "That's it, rightio," he would say. Just put the fold out next time. Out, he would say, always out. Rightio." They would run outside into the sun. Perhaps, he wondered, he didn't make the time or space he should for love. He fitted it in, and it flitted away. Perhaps he somehow chose why he couldn't say, predictable lines of work over love's wild circling, the folding of a blanket over the unfolding of locked arms. But sometimes it was just there, staring out an open window to see little Jodie look up and wave to him with the biggest smile. He was shocked to see love playing in a backyard of brown grass under a sprinkler's diamond spill. Shocked to know he'd been lucky enough to live and know it, to love and be loved. And he would watch his children playing outside in the sun, ashamed, amazed, for it was always sunny. This next piece I'll read, shorter, is simply about what happened to the death railway itself, which I came to see was really perhaps one of the most important characters in the novel. With the dream of a global Japanese empire lost to radioactive dust, the railway no longer had either purpose or support. The Japanese engineers and guards whose responsibility it was were imprisoned or repatriated. The slaves that had remained to maintain the line were freed. Within weeks of the end of the war, the line began welcoming its own end. It was abandoned by the Thais, it was dismantled by the English, it was pulled up and sold off by tribespeople. After a further time, the line began to bend and warp. Its banks broke, its embankments and bridges washed away, and its cuttings filled in. Abandonment ceded to metamorphosis. Where once death stalked, life returned. The line welcomed rain and sun. Seeds germinated in mass graves between skulls and femurs and broken pick handles. Tendrils rose up alongside dog spikes and clavicles, thrust around teat sleepers and tibias, scapulas, vertebrae, fibulas and femurs. The line welcomed weeds into the embankments the slaves had carried as dirt and rock in their tankers. It welcomed termites into the fallen bridge timbers the slaves had cut and carried and raised. It welcomed rust over the railway irons the slaves had shouldered in long rows. It welcomed rot and ruin. In the end, all that was left was the heat and the clouds of rain and insects and birds and animals and vegetation that neither knew nor cared. Humans are only one of many things, and all these things long to live, and the highest form of living is freedom. A man to be a man, a cloud to be a cloud, bamboo to be bamboo. Decades would pass. A few short sections would be cleared by those who thought memory mattered, transformed in time into strangely resurrected trunkless legs, tourist sites, national sites, sacred sites. For the line was broken, as all lines finally are. It was all for nothing, and of it, nothing remained. People kept on longing for meaning and hope, but the annals of the past are a muddy story of chaos only. And of that colossal ruin, boundless and buried, the lone and level jungle stretched far away. Of imperial dreams and dead men, all that remained was long grass. Thank you.
Maybe a place to start for us to talk about the book hesitated whether we should start with the title or the dedication, but maybe we should start with the dedication and then go back to the title. I can't pronounce the dedication properly, but you can.
Yeah, the dedication is to prisoner Sambiako Sanjigo, and although many things changed in the course of writing this novel, that never did. It was a Japanese number that I learnt as a child from my father, and it was his Japanese prisoner of war number, 335. And it is one of my earliest memories, learning that and how to count to 10 in Japanese.
And so this novel, I mean, certainly various reviewers have said, I don't know if you've said a version of this yourself maybe, that you know, the one novel you had to write, that you sort of, that this was an inescapable project. Is that fair to say?
That's true. I have said that. I get terrified in these sort of things because you say certain things so many times and then you try and say something different and contradict yourself just to please people who you're otherwise bored.
Like you only say one thing, right?
Yeah, I remember reading an article about Vargas Llosa when he ran for president of Peru against Fujimori, and they sent a minder in to work with him who worked for Margaret Thatcher because he was running on that monetarist sort of platform. And the minder wrote a story after about how appallingly frustrating it was dealing with Vargas Llosa, because everywhere he went, every speech he made, every interview he did, he tried to say something different and new, and the campaign collapsed into a mass of appalling contradictions. And
the notion of the stump speech.
Yeah, disaster within about 48 hours. And the minder said the lady knew in an election it was best to say one or two things over and over again, but preferably only one. But that's not really a novelist. But nevertheless, I'll try and do what the lady did. And the question was...
well, I think the question is really about... and I might ask you a question.
No, I wasn't.
It was about your dad. It was about, you know, the connection of this to your father. And
I couldn't write it. Yeah, no, I had to write it.
You had to write it. Was there a time when you felt you couldn't write it?
12 years.
Yes. But then you were working on it already. Was there a time before that where you thought, I will write this someday, but I can't write it yet?
It's true. I felt it. I felt it really as this stone within me, and the stone kept on getting bigger. I really felt it it crept up and was in the end of my throat. It was awful. And in the 12 years I was trying to write it and continually failing, I'd end up...
During which time, I might interject, you wrote a couple of other novels just by the by.
I did. I went to them and I wrote them, and then I'd come back to this. And it was never a novel I wanted to write because it frightened me so much, and I didn't know how to write it. And I didn't feel equal to it in any sense. And it wasn't a subject I wanted to write about. And yet, in the end, I was possessed of really a very irrational series of thoughts, and they were that if I didn't write this book, I would never write another book. And I just understood that about myself, and in the end, I knew that to be a truth. The second thing I came to think was that, again, there's no logical reason for this, but that I had to write this book before my father died, or I wouldn't be able to write it. And then my father was growing very old and frail, and I knew I just had to now go for broke and write what I could and try and make it work. So, it's strange, you know, the logic of these events is that there is a why to these things. But really, I think with writing books, I don't know how you experience, but I find that most of my books, there really is no why. I invent and concoct a lot of fictions more marvellous than my novels when I come to lie to people like you on these tours, but I don't know really why, you know.
But in some sense, I'm with you. I think that is true. There is no why, but it's hard not to feel there was some very profound why. Maybe it can't be reduced. Maybe it's an ineffable why. But it seems as though. And one thing I wondered in one conversation, you told a story about how when you had been to Japan and came back and spoke to your father about your trip, where you spoke to former soldiers and guards.
Yeah, I near the end of writing the novel, I knew I had to go to Japan at some point. I'm not a great researcher. In fact, I researched this book very little, really. Before I get to that, I think there is traumas are not really individual. They're social and communal, and they're not fixed in time. And I think when people experience great trauma, those wounds, don't end with their soul. They pass out into their families and their friends and finally communities and societies. I went south to a place past about 60 kilometres south of Hiroshima, where my father ended up as a slave labourer at war's end, working in a coal mine under the inland sea. And in another sort of paradoxical place where the mine head used to be, that my father and his mates used to have to run a gauntlet of sadistic guards, there now stood a love hotel. And the mayor of the city had heard I was coming, and he wanted to publicly apologise to me, and he got media there, which I found awkward, but to his credit, he apologised. And then I met a guard at the site of the mine, who also was very old, had worked at the mine, and the media wanted to take photographs of us, and they wanted us to put our arms around each other, and so I did that, and he did that, and he was about this high, he was tiny, and when they finished taking their photographs, I dropped my arm, and in that way, children, when they're ashamed or they just want comfort, he just stayed there with his arm around me, and he curled further in, and we just stood there for about a long time, perhaps a minute, and he just curled into me, and it's inexplicable. All these people expressed this deep, deep regret and asked me to apologise to my father for all his suffering and the suffering of his friends. So I got home, and my father rang. He was 98 by then. He rang within a few hours of me getting home, and he wanted to know all that had passed. He'd been very frightened about me going to Japan. And so I told him, I said the Japanese had been very kind and gracious and generous to me, and they had. And I told him that the guards I'd met had all apologised and wanted me to pass that on to him as strongly as I could. And he stopped talking, and there was a short silence, and then he said he had to go, and that was unlike him. And later that day, he had an excellent mind until the end, and he had terrific recall, but all memory of his prisoner of war experience was lost that afternoon. So he remembered everything before it, everything after it, but of his time in the camps, all he remembered, he knew he'd been there in the way you've been in the wound, you know it intellectually, but you don't know it. And one of my sisters said to me that it was as if he were finally free. So that's the story of me going there. I mean, then afterwards I went and I lived by myself. I mean, I have a family, and I'm a very social person, but I have a little shack on an island off Tasmania. I went there and lived by myself for 6 months, and I rewrote the novel top to bottom, and I wanted to try. I thought maybe all these things would help me. It seemed to matter to try and understand what good and evil are, what love is, what hate is, what
kindness is. And, you know, perhaps by writing this as a novel, I'd be able to divine these undivinable things. And when I finished the book, I realised I understood nothing, absolutely nothing at all. I simply had written a story.
But in some, I mean, maybe it's making a fiction to suggest it, but it seems as though in telling, and it's not your father's story strictly, I mean, it's a fiction, but in telling this story, you were somehow taking the burden from him.
I don't think he saw it that way, and it's not a fictionalised memoir, as perhaps I've led people to think here, and it couldn't be. That was the thing I understood about it, and you would understand as a writer that the moment you merely seek to lightly dust to powder reality, you end up writing trash and tosh, because it is as Oscar Wilde said, give me a mask and I can tell you the truth, but take the mask away and I can only lie. Is that your experience?
Well, I mean, it's one of the things, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is maybe you will say you have no answer, but what part was hardest? You know, was it finding the form? Was it dealing with this material? Was it somehow separating from the actual facts that you knew so that you had the freedom to invent? You know, I mean, all of those things, particularly with this story and its connection to you, seem incredibly tough.
Well, they were tough, and I wrote it as 5 different novels over that, not 5 drafts, but many drafts each of those novels, and then I destroyed each one. I deleted them off my hard drive, and I burnt all the manuscripts and all my notes, and I tend still to write a lot longhand.
You burnt your manuscripts?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, of course, because I find that they... I find old manuscripts are gangrenous, you know, that they're the rot in the flesh of the living, you know. You have to start again and, you know, have that courage to try and invent anew when you drag old things in. And I think the hard drive's pernicious in this way for modern writers, because they're always trying to shoehorn something from last year in, and it's... you know, it's like
it's a very good paragraph.
Yeah.
Find a place for it.
You end up with a boulder in the eye still, you know. It's not what you want.
Yeah. But so another related question.
Oh, sorry. So you want to know how I came to work out how to write it?
And I'll throw in a little coda. When was it only in the last version that you decided to have the points of view of the Japanese and Korean soldiers?
I always wanted that.
You always wanted that.
But it's really, I find it always a matter of voice and tone and structure. I mean, a novel without structure, it's like a jellyfish pretending to be a white pointer, you know. But determining what your structure is always the most difficult task. What happened was I realised it had to be a love story, and it had to be a love story not for any maudlin or pathetic reasons, but because I came to understand that if you wish to deal with something so dark, to make art only about darkness is in the end to create something untrue to what we understand about life, because human beings are always and inevitably creatures of hope. And Nietzsche said hope is the cruelest of human torments because it prolongs suffering. And that's true, but it is also the nub of us. And so the story, if I was to deal with these things, I needed hope. And the highest expression of hope, I believe, is love. And the essence of love is that we discover eternity in the universe in a moment that dies immediately afterwards. And I think that's why love doesn't have any rules, but I think love stories have many rules. And that's because great love stories seek to be true to the psychology and our understanding of our souls when we are in love. And it's that understanding of that really strange combination of the eternal and the ephemeral that's love, that demands death. my parents have always been fond of this story about a Latvian man who lived in the little town where I've been born, and he'd immigrated to Australia after the war. But during the war he'd been caught in those great movements of peoples that happened in Eastern Europe, and when he finally got back to his home village at war's end, it was to discover it razed to the ground, and his wife, he was told, dead. And he searched that apocalyptic post-war world of the Red Cross camps and the internment centres, trying to find his wife, hoping against hope, and finally having to accept after 2 years that she was dead. And he immigrated to Australia, ended up in this little town, married an Australian woman, had a family. And then in 1957 he went to Sydney, and he was walking down a crowded street, and he saw walking towards him his Latvian wife with a child on either hand. And he had a few moments in which to decide if he would acknowledge her or whether he would walk on. And I always thought, growing up, that was the most beautiful story about love I'd ever heard, about the terrible question of it, the courage it demands, the questions it asks of us. Right at the beginning of writing this novel, I've been walking across Sydney Harbour Bridge, 2001, and it's very beautiful. Late afternoon, the light on the water, the shadows in the ironwork. And I remembered this story, and there's a great promenade on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and there are lots of people, and I thought, it occurred to me what it would be like for a prisoner of war who thought the woman he loved had died during the war, to see her many years later walking towards him on the bridge. And I was so excited by this, I rushed back to the Rocks, which you remember from your childhood, I'd imagine. And I found a pub, and I wrote this story out, this chapter out on the back of beer coasters with a biro borrowed from a barman. And I got all these soggy bits.
You didn't burn that, did you?
I have burnt that, yeah. But I kept them for many years, and I refound them after I'd written these other novels.
And was that story always?
No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
And
Okay.
I saw that, and I realised that was the key to putting a love story in the novel, and it really then everything sort of fell into place, what it had to be and where it would go to and how it would balance. So that's how I came to understand how I should write the book. But as you know, well, maybe do you find that it's well, it's an awful process. What can I say? It makes it sound so simple. Even up here, it wasn't simple.
Is your watch on? Is it on time or fast?
Well, Claire and I have struggled with time out the back.
Because if it's on time, then I'm going to sneak one more question, and then we should open it up. But if
I think it's on time. Yeah.
damn, okay, damn. So I'm going to sneak one little question more, because Richard's first masterpiece, Gould's Book of Fish, which if you've read it, you know, has much brutality in it also, but is this incredibly joyful, actually lively. It's been described as magical realism. I'm not sure if is that what it is? Maybe, I don't know. But it certainly it limbs the fantastical and the imaginary, and is written in a very, very different way. And this, as you can tell from just from the small portions that Richard read, is very much in a reality that we recognize. Sometimes that's incredibly painful to be in, and not just in the prisoner of war camp. I mean, there are other places where it's a painful reality, and I just wondered about that choice, whether along the way you had there had been other. Not just other novels, but other modes. I know you tried writing it as haikus at one point.
Yeah, well, a terrible idea, terribly executed, and that one got the match fairly early on. I tried writing it as a haibun, which is the traditional Japanese form, a nature journal.
Which is the form of the title.
The book from which the title is. Basho's Narrow Road to the Deep North is a haibun. I tried writing it in the first person plural. I tried writing a fantastical one where the Japanese won, the Japanese won the war. All sorts of things. But I mean, what I always try and do, every book, I try and destroy everything I've done in the last book and begin anew and try and do things try and find a new style of writing, because I think when you write, if you find, if you're lucky, a few ways of expressing something that touches on truth. But with your next book, if you use those same tropes, you begin to actually express not truth but a falsehood, and it becomes a lazy trick and your own cliche, and at that point you're deceiving yourself and you're cheating the reader, and you can't do that. So you must struggle again to find a new form that's got that raw electric energy of truth, and that should always be a hard thing. And I always like all those artists who constantly try a new form again and again. I think that makes demands of you that hopefully enable you to speak to the truth rather than just deliver up a portmanteau of lies, which you see happen with some writers. You know, they find a way that's easy, they plough the same furrow. You know that sort of writer, and in the end, splendid as they are, they've grown lazy and the word's fat, and the whole thing fails.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You like to be uncomfortable.
No, I think writing should, writing should aim to express some truth. And I think that's a very difficult thing, and I've probably mostly failed all my life at it, but I do understand the necessity of always trying to find a balance of words that can do that, and that demands of me that I constantly try and find new ways of using words.
Thank you. I think this is, if your watch is true, it is time, sadly, I mean, wonderfully, but sadly for me, just because I wish this could go on for 2 hours, as I'm sure you do too. But please, let's open it to the audience, and if people have questions. Yes, sir. I think there's a mic there. I don't.
My family were in China in both Japanese invasions, and I heard many of the same kind of things. I was always shocked by Ballard having a slightly romantic vision of the Japanese in the context of the Chinese. And Australians are very, very close to China and Japan. In London, I hear Australians talking about their Australian attitude to Chinese and Russians. I mean, you have your father, but you also have the Australians around you. I mean, did that have any bearing? I mean, was there something particular about the Australian attitude, the closeness and maybe paranoia, anxiety on a racial level about the Chinese and the Japanese? I mean, people of the family went through that, never got over it. I mean, they could not be on the same side of the street with Japanese. I mean,
I'll just very briefly summarize the last moment so that the people in the back. Yes, but it's for the other people in the audience. I was just going to share it.
Yeah, I think Claire wants it because the people up the back wouldn't have heard it, so she's just going to repeat
That's all I
it.
was saying.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to summarize the end, and is it fair to say that one...
you brought up with your father, but you also brought up with your
Yes, so the question of being whether the Australian society, with its attitude towards the Japanese and in the wake of the Second World War, whether that was a factor in the writing of the book.
Well, Australia, like every country, was and is full of racist attitudes. The time of the war, it was predominantly white European and Aboriginal, and it saw itself as superior to Asian people. I mean, that's unquestionably so. But there was equally a strong racial element on the part of the Japanese. They saw themselves as racially superior to the Korean Guards, and they wanted to prove themselves racially over the European prisoners. That was a strong aspect of it.
And in that, they'd taken on a lot of the ideology of European nationalism. So you had those things working both ways. I think what's extraordinary and in some ways beautiful about it is that it's the moment, I think, that Australia began to understand that it wasn't European, that it was part of Asia. And I think it's also, with these ex-prisoners of war, so many of them became quite Asian in their beliefs and attitudes. You know, I've been in the houses of some that even seem quite Asian. They also, hate is understandable and very powerful, and I think even for many people necessary to help them survive. And hate was strong with many of the Australian survivors for a long time, but most abandoned it and saw no progress or hope in it. And they did find a way of forgiveness and understanding. And I was brought up very strongly with the belief that we weren't to judge the Japanese as a people, that these things were cultural. That was my upbringing. And you meet many people whose families who were brought up with something similar. But I think what you experience in these traumas is the incommunicable sense of what it is to be fully human. The horror, the evil, the goodness, the possibility that exists in every human being to be all things. And so I think at that point, these strange labels we put on each other, Japanese, American, Australian, cease to really help us understand anything much at all. And these people have lived an experience so profound, they couldn't give tongue to it. But I think they understood so much more than so many who didn't live it.
We have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
The Latvian man, did he tell the story of his life? Is that how everybody knew about it? And I wasn't sure whether he said hello to the Latvian wife.
That would be telling.
You know, literature's really a milky way of thieves and robbers stealing from everywhere, and I'm but one more. And I stole the ending of his story, and to give you the answer to that, you'd have to read the novel.
Which I encourage everyone to do. Thank you, Richard.